The whole thing started with $5. That is what they sold him for. $5. A Belgian Malinois with a service record, thousands of hours of training behind him, and a nose that could find a single drop of blood in a flooded field. The department wrote him off as useless, put him at the very back of a surplus auction, and let an old man walk away with him for the price of a cheap lunch. 3 days later, that same old man was standing in his kitchen with a telephone pressed to his ear, his hand shaking, calling the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Because in those 3 days, the dog that everyone said was broken had found something. Something a whole police department had spent 8 months failing to find. Something that certain people had gone to a great deal of trouble to keep buried. This is the story of a dog named Diesel, an old man named Earl Dawson, and the $5 mistake that unraveled everything. It is a story about being written off. About the worth that other people cannot see. And about the terrible, patient loyalty of an animal who refused to give up on a job that no one had even realized he was still doing. If you love true stories about loyalty, about justice, and about the ones the world was ready to throw away, stay with me all the way to the end. Because what this dog did in 3 short days is something the people in that county still talk about to this day. But to understand why it mattered so much, you first have to understand why they called him useless in the first place. Diesel came into the Redfield County Sheriff's Department as the most promising young dog anyone there had seen in years. He was a Belgian Malinois, lean and dark and wound tight as a spring, the kind of dog that never fully relaxes because his mind is always working. His trainers loved him at first. He learned faster than any dog in his class. His nose was extraordinary, almost unsettling. In scent detection drills, he found things the instructors had hidden so well they had nearly forgotten where they put them. And then, in his second year, something changed. Diesel started alerting on things that were not supposed to be there. An alert, for a working dog, is a signal. A trained behavior that tells the handler, there is something here, right here, pay attention. And Diesel began giving that signal in places that made people uncomfortable. He alerted on a patrol car that had just been cleared. He alerted, twice, on an evidence locker that was supposed to be clean. And most troubling of all, he began to alert, hard and insistent, whenever a certain senior officer walked past him. His name was Lieutenant Boyd Hartzell. And Lieutenant Hartzell did not care for that dog one bit. Now, the handlers tried to explain it away. A dog can alert on a lingering scent, a trace of something that passed through a place hours or days before. It does not always mean what it seems to mean. But Diesel would not stop. Every time Hartzell came near, the dog's whole body would go rigid, his focus locking on like a searchlight, and he would give that low, certain signal that meant something is wrong here. An embarrassing dog. An inconvenient dog. And a dog, according to the paperwork that started appearing in his file, that was becoming unreliable. Unpredictable. Difficult to control. The reports pile up, one after another, most of them signed off by the same senior officer, until the conclusion wrote itself. Diesel was declared unfit for service. Washed out. Useless. They did not even try to rehome him properly. A properly retired working dog usually goes to his handler, or to a careful adoption program. But Diesel was quietly slipped onto the list for a county surplus auction, the kind where they sell off-dented filing cabinets and old office chairs, buried so far down the sheet that almost nobody would notice a living animal was on it at all. Almost nobody. But not quite nobody. Because one man read the list all the way to the bottom. Earl Dawson was 72 years old, and he felt every one of those years in the mornings. He had spent 30 years as a canine handler himself, 2 counties over, before his knees and his back finally forced him to hang it up. He knew dogs. He knew them the way some men know engines or weather, deep in the bone, in a way that cannot be taught. And for most of his life, there had always been a working dog at his side. But that was over now. He had retired. His last partner, a shepherd named Gus, had passed of old age 3 winters back. And then, that same spring, his wife of 44 years, his Ruth, had passed too, quietly, in her sleep, and taken most of the light in the house with her. Now Earl lived alone at the end of a long gravel road, in a farmhouse that was far too quiet, and he was, if he was honest with himself, waiting. Just waiting. He felt like a tool that had been set down in the back of a drawer. Used up. Put away. Useless. He read the surplus auction listings the way some lonely men read the obituaries, out of a habit he could not quite explain. And that was how his eye caught the single line, near the very bottom, between a lot of broken radios and a stack of old traffic cones. One Belgian Malinois. Retired K9. Unfit for service. Sold as is. Earl read that line 3 times. Unfit for service. He had signed off on enough dogs in his life to know what those words usually hid. Sometimes a dog really was done. And sometimes, he knew, a dog was just inconvenient to somebody, and those words were the polite way of getting rid of a problem. He got in his truck the next morning and drove 2 hours to that auction. He did not fully know why. He just knew he could not stand to let a working dog be sold off like a stack of traffic cones and not at least look him in the eye first. The auction yard was cold and half empty when Earl found the kennel at the far end. The dog inside was not what the paperwork had led him to expect. He had pictured a wreck of an animal, wild-eyed, snapping, the kind of dog that gets cold dangerous. Instead he found a lean, dark Malinois lying perfectly still, his head on his paws, watching everything with quiet, intelligent eyes. Not broken. Not wild. Just watchful. Waiting, the way Earl himself had been waiting. Earl crouched down at the kennel door, his knees popping, and he did something the auction workers thought was a little strange. He did not talk to the dog like a pet. He gave a command. A soft, low-working command, the kind he had used 10,000 times in his career. The dog's ears came up at once. His whole body changed. And he executed the command instantly, cleanly, perfectly, then looked back at Earl with an expression that the old man could only describe, later, as relief. As if to say, finally. Finally, someone who speaks my language. Useless, Earl thought. There is nothing useless about this dog at all. When the auctioneer got to the bottom of the list, to the lot that was a living creature, there was not a single other bid. Nobody wanted a washed-up police dog with a bad file. So Earl Dawson raised one weathered hand and bought him for the opening bid, and the opening bid was $5. He paid it in a single bill, folded in soft from his wallet. He signed 1 page of paperwork. And then he loaded a dog named Diesel into the passenger seat of his old truck and drove him 2 hours home down a long gravel road, and for the first time in 3 years, the seat beside him was not empty. He had no idea, none at all, that he had just brought the answer to an 8-month mystery into his own home. The first day was quiet. Diesel explored the old farmhouse with a careful, methodical patience, room by room, nose down, mapping the place in scent the way working dogs do. He ate well. He let Earl brush him. At night he lay down at the foot of the bed with a long sigh, and Earl lay awake a while just listening to the sound of another living thing breathing in the house, a sound he had missed more than he ever admitted. But on the second day, something changed. And Earl, who had spent 30 years reading dogs, noticed it right away. Diesel would not settle. He kept going to the north-facing window, the one that looked out over the fields toward the county road, and he would stand there, rigid, staring at something Earl could not see. His ears forward. His weight shifted onto his front legs. And every so often, that low, certain signal, the same one that had gotten him thrown out of a police department, that same alert, aimed out across the empty fields. A younger man, a man who did not know dogs, would have seen a restless animal in a new home and thought nothing of it. But Earl felt the hair stand up on his arms. Because he knew that posture. He knew that signal. That was not a dog missing his old kennel. That was a working dog telling his handler, as clearly as he knew how, that there is something out there, and you need to come and see. Earl stood beside him at the window for a long time, following the line of the dogs stare out across the fields to the tree line beyond. And a memory began to stir, and cold, at the back of his mind. Something he had seen on the local news, months ago. Something he had half forgotten. He went and dug through the stack of old newspapers by the wood stove. And there, in an issue from the previous autumn, he found the face he was looking for. A young woman, smiling in a photograph. Katie Marrow, 23 years old, who had vanished from Redfield County 8 months earlier and had never been found. The search had gone cold. The town had grieved and moved on. Most people had quietly concluded that poor Katie Marrow was never coming home. Earl looked at the photograph. Then he looked at his dog, still frozen at the window, still staring out toward that distant tree line. And a terrible thought began to take shape. He almost talked himself out of it. Any sensible man would have. An old widower and a washed-out dog do not solve missing person cases. That is not how the world works. He told himself he was a lonely old fool reading meaning into a restless animal, seeing patterns because he needed, to feel useful again just once before the end. But that night, Diesel did not sleep. He paced. He returned again and again to that window, and once, in the small hours, he stood at the front door and gave a single low whine, and looked back over his shoulder at Earl with an urgency that the old man could not shake off. So on the third morning, Earl Dawson made a decision. He clipped a lead onto his $5 dog, put on his old coat, and said, "All right. Show me." And the dog showed him. Diesel took him out across the north field with the focused, striding pace of an animal on a working scent, a pace Earl had to hurry to keep up with, his breath fogging in the cold air. Over the fence line. Along the edge of the tree line. Down toward an old, abandoned property that Earl vaguely remembered had once belonged to a family that kept to themselves. And there, at the corner of a rundown hut on the edge of that neglected land, Diesel stopped, sat down hard, and gave his alert. Full. Certain. Absolute. This. Right here. This is it. Earl did not go any closer. 30 years of training told him not to disturb whatever this was. But he stood there in the cold with his heart pounding, and he knew, with a certainty that frightened him, that his dog had not brought him out here for nothing. And then the last piece fell into place, and it turned his blood to ice. He remembered why he was standing in his kitchen instead of just calling the local sheriff. Because that old property, that neglected land at the edge of the county, was connected, everybody had always said so, to the family of a certain senior officer in the Redfield County Sheriff's Department. An officer named Boyd Hartzell. The same officer the dog had alerted on, again and again, until they threw him away for it. Earl stood very still in the cold morning air, and he understood at last what he was looking at. This dog had been trying to tell them the truth for 2 years. And somebody had sold him for $5 to make sure the truth stayed buried. That was when Earl went home, and picked up the telephone, and did not call the local police at all. He called the FBI. They almost did not believe him. An old man, a retired handler 2 counties over, calling in about a cold case based on the behavior of a dog he had bought at a surplus auction for $5. It sounded, Earl knew, like exactly the kind of call that gets a polite thank you and a quiet hang up. But the agent who took the call was a careful man, and something in Earl's steady, unhurried voice made him listen. Earl did not ramble. He laid it out the way a 30-year professional lays things out. The dog's service record. The pattern of alerts on a specific officer. The washout that did not add up. The location. The connection to Hartzell's family land. And the cold case of a young woman at the local department, the very department that had thrown this dog away, had never managed to solve. The agent stopped taking notes about halfway through and started listening very carefully indeed. Because here is the thing the local department had never known, or had chosen not to know. There had been quiet whispers about Lieutenant Boyd Hartzell for years. Evidence that went missing. Cases that fell apart. A department that seemed, somehow, never quite able to close in on certain people. The FBI already had a thin, cold, frustrating file open on Redfield County. They had suspicion. What they had never had was a thread to pull. An old man and a $5 dog had just handed them one. They came 3 days later. Not the local sheriff. Federal agents, quietly, with a warrant, out to that neglected property at the edge of the county. Earl was not there for it. He sat in his kitchen with his hand resting on Diesel's head, waiting, the way he had waited for so much in his life. And what they found on that property broke the case wide open. Katie Merrow was alive. I want to be careful here, because this is where a story like this could turn dark, and this is not a dark story. It is a story about a light that would not go out. So let me only tell you what matters. That young woman, who the whole county had given up on, who her own family had begun to grieve as lost forever, was found alive on that property. Held there. Hidden. In a place that a police department connected to the man who put her there had somehow never thought to search. She went home to her family. Whatever comes after such a thing, however long the road back, she got to walk it. She got to go home. And she got to do it because a dog that everyone called useless spent 3 days staring out a window until the one man who understood him finally said, "Show me." The rest came apart quickly after that. The federal investigation did not stop at one property. It followed the thread that Diesel had handed them, back through years of quiet corruption, and Lieutenant Boyd Hartzell, the man who had signed report after report calling a good dog unreliable, the man who had made sure the dog was sold off cheap and forgotten, was arrested at his desk. He was not the only one. Before it was over, that department had been turned inside out, and a great deal of buried truth had finally seen daylight. And every bit of it started with a $5 bill and a nose that would not lie. The story got out, of course. Stories like that always do. It started small, a line in the local paper, and then it spread, the way these things spread, until it was on every television in the county and far beyond. The washed-out police dog. The $5 sale. The old retired handler who saw what a whole department had missed. The missing woman brought home. The corruption exposed. People could not get enough of it, and for good reason. It was the kind of story that reminds folks the world is not always as unfair as it seems, that sometimes the truth does claw its way back into the light, carried there on 4 legs by an animal too loyal to quit. Reporters came out to the old farmhouse at the end of the gravel road. They wanted a photograph of the hero dog. And what they found was not some fierce, decorated police animal posing for the cameras. What they found was a lean dark Malinois lying in a patch of sun on an old porch, with his head on the knee of a 72-year-old man, both of them looking, for the first time in a long time, entirely at peace. The Redfield County Sheriff's Department, humiliated, tried to reclaim him. Once the dog was a hero, suddenly he was not so useless after all. They talked about his value, his training, the fact that technically the sale might be revisited. Earl Dawson listened to all of that very politely. And then he said one sentence, and it made the local paper, and people in that county repeated it for years afterward. "You sold him for $5, Earl said. You don't get to call him priceless now." Diesel stayed exactly where he was. On the porch. In the sun. Home. Katie Merrow came to visit, once she was ready. Months later, she drove out to the end of that gravel road, and she knelt down in front of a dog she had never met, a dog who had found her when no one else could, and she put her arms around his neck and cried into his fur, and Diesel, that difficult, washed-out animal, held perfectly, patiently still and let her. Earl stood on the porch and watched, and did not trust himself to speak. The two of them, the old man and the dog, were never apart after that. They had found each other at the bottom of a surplus list, two lives that the world had decided were finished, set out to be forgotten for the price of a folded bill. And instead they had given each other the one thing neither of them had expected to feel again. They had made each other useful. They had made each other matter. Diesel lived out his years on that farm, in the sun, at the side of a man who understood him. And Earl Dawson, who had felt like a tool put away in the back of a drawer, spent those same years knowing that his eye, his instinct, his 30 years of hard-won knowledge, had reached down at the very last and pulled a young woman back from being lost forever. Neither of them was finished after all. Not even close. So that is the story of a dog named Diesel and a $5 bill. Of everything in it, here is the part one keep coming back to. It is not the arrest. It is not even the rescue, as much as that matters. It is that window. It is the image of a dog standing at a north-facing window, day after day, staring out at an empty field, giving a signal that everyone around him had spent 2 years being trained to ignore. He never stopped telling the truth. Not once. Even after they called him broken. Even after they threw him away for $5. He just kept faithfully pointing at the thing that was wrong, and waited, with the endless patience of a creature who cannot understand why no one is listening, for someone to finally believe him. That is the thing about the ones we write off. The useless dog. The old man at the end of the gravel road. The cold case nobody wants to reopen. We are so quick to decide that something is finished, that it has no worth left, that it can be sold for the price of a sandwich and forgotten. And we are so often, so completely wrong. Somebody in your life, maybe, has been written off. Maybe it is a person. Maybe, some days, it feels like it might be you. If this story reminds you of anything, let it remind you of this. Worth does not disappear just because other people stop seeing it. Sometimes it just stands quietly at a window, waiting for the one person who will finally say, "Show me." If this story moved you, do me a small favor and leave a comment below. Tell me what you thought of Diesel, and tell me about a time somebody, or some animal, surprised the people who had given up on them. I read every single one. And if you believe that loyalty like this deserves to be remembered, give this video a like so more people get to hear it, and share it with someone who needs the reminder today. If you are new here, and you love true stories about courage, loyalty, and the animals who refuse to give up on us, then subscribe and stay a while. Every week, I bring you another one, told all the way through, from beginning to end. Next time, I want to tell you about a retired war dog who was left behind at a shelter, and the disabled veteran who walked in one afternoon and recognized him from a battlefield half a world away. Until then, take a good look